are we?
Hello, and welcome to this Boston Globe event, Back to School, How Higher Ed Leaders Can Avoid Ransomware Attacks. Today's panel is sponsored by Wasabi Technologies, and we'll start with some remarks by Andrew Smith, Senior Manager for Strategy and Market Intelligence at Wasabi. Andrew, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you again for having me here today. I'm a manager at Wasabi. I lead our competitive and market intelligence team. I want to kind of set the stage for the panel a little bit today on why ransomware is so important from an infrastructure perspective, especially, and how it impacts the way that we think about markets and why it isn't going away. So a little bit of recent history. I mean, ransomware was added to the Oxford English Dictionary just in 2018, a few years ago. And interestingly, ransomware as a search term hit its peak popularity in Google in mid-December of 2021, so just about 8 months ago. So I think what we've seen is the fact that ransomware is having an impact. Its prevalence is having an impact on how we design infrastructure services and how we think about the market. Analyst firm Gartner said that by 2025, 60% of all enterprises will require storage products to have integrated ransomware defense mechanisms, which would be up from 10% in 2022. So it's becoming a demand from organizations as a key purchasing criteria for infrastructure services as well. Gartner refers to this combination of storage infrastructure and ransomware defense as quote unquote cyber storage. But I think regardless of what you call it, whether you call it cyber storage or something else, it highlights this kind of changing market paradigm characterized by a combination or a growing combination of security and infrastructure services as a way to improve data resilience. And that data resilience helps kind of prevent or mitigate ransomware as one of the key use cases. So we see things like data immutability, replication across regions, distribution of data across physical networks, in this case, public cloud, private cloud, things like that, all growing as in importance in the context of ransomware prevention and mitigation. So why, I guess going back to the key question, why has ransomware had such an outsized impact on how we think about IT infrastructure services? And I think the key answer is because it works. Research from IDC showed that more than 90% of organizations have been attacked by malware ransomware, and more than 80% have suffered a successful attack. And for those that have been successfully attacked by ransomware, the consequences cited were significant: downtime, loss of sensitive and secret business data, and outages of a few days, ranging from a few days to weeks because of ransomware incidents. And if you factor into this equation that the average cost of downtime for organizations is typically estimated between $100,000 and $300,000 per hour, the span of days and weeks in terms of outages or downtime equates to millions of dollars in damages. All of this tied to a ransomware attack. So high stakes, and then kind of the elephant in the room when you're talking about ransomware is how many organizations end up paying for ransomware. And recent data from a survey conducted by Haiku and Actual Tech Media, which is coming out next month, it's called The State of Ransomware Preparedness, showed that just under 20% of organizations were forced to pay ransom. So you kind of have these competing factors of facing downtime and outages and the cost of that versus paying the cost of ransom, and seeing that 20% or near 20% of organizations end up paying the ransom was shockingly high to me, seemed shockingly high to me, but reiterates the fact that ransomware in many cases works, right? That's paying the ransom is the best case scenario for the attacker. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context on ransomware, some interesting data points to consider as we go through this conversation today, and as you think about the impact of ransomware for the viewers on your business and how you're strategizing. But with that, I will sign off for now and hand back to Aaron.
Andrew, thanks very much for that useful introduction, which will, I think, help guide the discussion. I will mention a couple of times for anyone who's watching that we do have the Q&A function enabled down below. So if you have any questions during the panel, we'll get to them sooner or later, and you can just use the Q&A function down below. But let me first introduce the panelists. First, from Boston cybersecurity company Black Kite, we have Chief Technology Officer and co-founder Candon Balukabas. From the Center of Internet Security, Chief Technology Officer Kathleen Moriarty. And then from Boston College, Director Computer Security and Policy, David Escalante. So we have a lot of expertise here in the room, so to speak. And I think we'll start off at a very high level, maybe talking about how ransomware is impacting higher education. Maybe Candon, you can start from the vendor perspective. How bad is this plague of ransomware? What are you seeing, especially in terms of higher education clients?
So we actually recently collected all major ransomware events in the whole planet, and the numbers were scary. Unfortunately, Andrew was spot on. The average cost of a ransomware incident is somewhere around $15.1 million. Unfortunately, it's really bad, but 80% of the targets are in the US or EU zone. So meaning that we are prime targets. So hacker groups are aware of that. They can select us because we have enough financial power. We can pay for them. And interestingly, though, there is a secret alignment between some hacker groups, especially Russian-originated and also China-originated hacker groups. So it seems that there is an alignment that, hey, let's not attack each other. Let's attack to other side. So that's the kind of, unfortunately, cyber warfare is going on. And when we do this analysis for the higher ed, actually, we have a metric called Ransomware Susceptibility Index that we did for lots of organizations. We did for automotive, we did for government, pharma, and of course, higher ed. The average is 0.45. It's not too bad, but it's still, 0.5 is where we say, hey, you can start looking where that red button is. So you need to be ready to press that button. 0.45 is slightly below the average. The reason for higher ed is not being primarily be at the prime target of hackers is because return of investment. Unfortunately, it's not because higher eds are secure. Hackers are aware of the return of investment on attacking to higher ed organizations is not that profitable. That's why kind of a little bit below the average of some of the others, like pharma, for example, or healthcare. Seems that they've been targeted more frequently. Unfortunately, the picture is not super good when we look from that angle, but at least there's a slightly good news for higher eds.
That's right. I think, the most prominent attacks we've heard of, like the Colonial Pipeline, are companies with considerable resources. Kathleen, tell me a little more maybe on Andrew's point about why higher ed is in the sights then, if there are these other targets. What is it that makes higher ed attractive?
Sure. So thinking about the data that's held in higher ed institutions, personnel data, right? So for any employees, that's common for all organizations. You also have student data. Besides that, you get into the more valuable data, which would be research data and also course materials. So as an adjunct for Georgetown, I have 2 courses that are fully online. That material could easily be lifted and reused somewhere else. And that's concerning, right? Because there's considerable thought and time put into these courses to help develop students and the programs offered at a university. So one of the trends that NISA has cited is that it's not just your data being leaked, it's also now that data is being sold to the highest bidder, right? And so competitors could gain access to your data. So resiliency isn't quite enough. And so as higher ed, you might be concerned that your research data is exposed or sold to the highest bidder, or your course materials are sold to the highest bidder.
David, you're right here on the front lines at Boston College. Tell us a little about how you see ransomware in the whole scheme of different threats that hackers and other malware present. Is ransomware top of mind for you? How is it looking right now?
I think that's a good question, Aaron. The way ransomware gets into various institutions is similar to the way other types of malware get into institutions. So to some degree, if I have some endpoint computer at my institution that's compromised. It would be bad if it had ransomware. It would also be bad if it had a keystroke logger and somebody stole all the passwords from it. It might be bad if somebody was using it to send out some kind of spam or phishing type thing, which looked like it came from our institution and got us blacklisted. So there are a variety of issues that you can have if you have an endpoint that gets malware on it, irrespective of whether the malware is ransomware or not. The thing that's really troubling about ransomware to us is this recent trend the last few years into enterprise ransomware, which is, I think, what Kathleen was alluding to, where they're trying to steal your data and collect a bigger ransom because they've compromised many, many computers as opposed to just the computer that has the ransomware initially on it. And that is certainly top of mind because there are various educational institutions that have lost the ability to conduct business because so many computers were taken down by enterprise ransomware, much the way that kind of thing happened to Colonial, I think someone mentioned a few minutes ago.
Thank you. Kathleen, I wanted to follow up maybe, what our hope is that no one will get ransomware. I want to talk about some of the things that happen when you do get it, but what kind of advice or what kind of trends are you seeing in terms of fighting off ransomware or best practices that people maybe should start thinking about to oppose this?
Sure, it's a great question. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet until we get to the point where security is built in and managed over time. So more from the vendor side, we have to focus on what's available to us, which are foundational controls and following a prioritized risk-assessed set of controls for implementation. And so with that, the Institute for Security and Technology, which CIS participated in, produced a report that does just that, a defense-based guide for how do you protect against ransomware. And it's called the Ransomware, the Blueprint for Ransomware Defense, sorry. And this uses the CIS controls, which what's unique about those is we've mapped out all of the threats that can happen to an environment, and it's prioritized by what we actually see in data. So if you look at all the data sources that collect threat data, we've taken that in and we've looked at, what do we see the most of? So phishing and other attacks, just like David mentioned, and then prioritize the defenses. So you know what to go after first to get rid of the low-hanging fruit and then work your way up to a more secure state. And like I said, ideally, we'll get to a place where vendors start providing products that are secure out of the box, because it's really a lot to ask of organizations to do this. And we see some of that with hardened images, and you can make these purchases if you're some of the services you purchase. So if you're a university, you might look for something, a service that's hardened to a security control framework or to CIS benchmarks, which are just a thorough set of controls that ensure that your system is maintained to a more expected security level. And that's really what we have to strive for. And as customers, you have to start asking for this built-in security and change that expectation.
David, I was reading a Verizon cybersecurity report from this year, and one of the comments they made was, it's not James Bond stuff that's getting ransomware infecting a lot of computers. It's often from humans clicking on a link that maybe they shouldn't have. You're there with all the faculty and thousands of students. What's your perspective on how we can avoid getting infected?
Yes, another good question. One of the ways that you can end up being compromised by ransomware is when your credentials, your username and password get taken. And they can get taken by some kind of a phishing scheme where you click on a link that says there's a problem with the network or whatever, and you need to re-authenticate, and it harvests your username and password so that the bad actor who's trying to do something to your system doesn't have to go after vulnerabilities or figure out how to get into your computer to download something even though they're not supposed to, because they have your login. And if you're a system administrator, that's potentially even worse if you gave them the login that's used to like run a whole bunch of computers at your institution or enterprise. So the issue there is to me there's a lot of stuff in the how to protect yourself against ransomware that talks about education and training as an effective means of stopping ransomware. And at least from my perspective, it's a means of reducing the number of incidents you could have, but it doesn't eliminate ransomware. So an example is if you have 10, I believe a good percentage, if you're doing training, is that like 90% of the people remember the training and do the right thing. So if you have 10 administrators, right, and then you send out and you train them all and everything is great and they know that they're not supposed to do certain things, they're not supposed to give up their password. And then somebody does a spear phishing attack on your institution and sends email to those 10 administrators saying, do this thing. It doesn't make any difference that 9 out of 10 of them didn't fall for the email. The one who fell for the email and put in the administrator credentials is enough for the bad actor to get into your institution and do whatever they want, which is why you see other things sort of layered on top of all these recommendations that I'm sure people are going to make through the course of the next 45 minutes. But if you have multi-factor authentication, that can help you for the case that somebody got through the front door and now they're trying to work their way further into the system. Did that address what you were coming after there?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Camden, tell us, you're, I assume, trying to develop some solutions for this that maybe are, go beyond just training people, but tell me a little about how it looks from your point of view about how to avoid ransomware, how you can help your clients avoid it.
Yeah, no, indeed, that's right. It's not the James Bond stuff. They are exploiting the things that we made it exploitable. So one of the most common thing is phishing. As that's, I think it's 40% plus is phishing. And phishing is actually not only the way that they are exploiting your organization credentials, but also they're finding out that credentials from another service that you're using. Let's say they found your Facebook password, and guess what? A lot of people are using the same password on Facebook and an organization. So unfortunately, that is one of the common things that we're seeing. So a couple of scary numbers around that. There are 14 billion email password combination available in the deep dark web now, 14 billion. So it's more than the double of the human population. Deduplicated number is somewhere around 3 billion credentials. It's really high. Any organization on the planet probably has some credentials on the deep dark web. It's enough to start a spear phishing campaign. So that's number one. But guess what? The opposite to that is what we are seeing in the insurance data. 90% of the phishing attacks through the phishing campaigns can be stopped by multi-factor authentication. It's very valid because, again, these hackers are not magicians and they are not going for exploiting an ISP along with the credentials. It's not that complicated. When they see the two-factor, they just back off because it's too complex to get around it. That's one.
And
second one that we're
just to explain to the listeners, when we say multi-factor authentication, those are the systems where a number gets sent to your phone maybe, or you have an app or a little device that gives you a code number that changes over time, and you have to add that in addition to your password.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the second most common thing is when you have services open to internet, especially that requires username and password. So they are trying the brute forcing. Brute forcing is meaning that try every single username and password combinations. So that's also another common methodology that we're seeing. About 30% of them are exploiting either the known vulnerability on the system, that service, or finding out a valid username and password by brute forcing those systems. So what can be done against these things? A method called whitelisting. So if you know that who is going to access to that service, you can simply create a whitelisted IP address and access to that only. It's very effective. That's why insurance companies are actually forcing their clients so many times, hey, implement multi-factor authentication and implement whitelisting. It is going to reduce your ransomware attack surface significantly. It's going to reduce from like 80% to 10%. It's very difficult to exploit. And I know that is a fact. When I was working for NATO's Counter Cyber Terrorist Task Force, we were doing similar things in there. So our task usually assigned find a way to break into a government agency, and they are a lot more difficult to break into than higher ed education. And most of the time when we find a company who doesn't have multi-factor and also not whitelisting IP addresses, that's a prime target. When we found those things, and then 95% we are breaking into government agencies, let alone higher eds. So if you let these things kind of narrow it down, it's actually effective. So I don't want to bombard the additional technical details at this moment, but those are the two things that I can say that hackers are heavily exploiting, and there is a solution for that if we can properly. I'm not saying that it's easy, because whitelisting is a lot of work. Similarly, multi-factor authentication for every application is still a lot of work, but it's a doable things, at least in a limited amount of resources.
Thank you. And, as we've heard the statistics, even with the countermeasures that are available, a lot of institutions are getting infected with ransomware. There was even the story of Lincoln College in Illinois that closed down in part because the ransomware attack made them unable to take new applications for next year's student class. So it is a serious problem. So I'd like to delve into a little bit about what people want to talk about. If a ransomware attack happens, what's the possible damage, and what are sort of the next steps? I did see one survey that Sophos did said 61% of higher education institutions that were infected with ransomware paid a ransom to try and get their data unlocked, which, as you might guess from unknown mysterious hackers, doesn't always result in getting the data back. But Candon, let's start with you. What would you advise, and what do you see when a ransomware attack succeeds and the institution is then dealing with the fallout?
Yeah, unfortunately, I gotta say, off the record, yes, most of the time they are paying, although all government bodies and authorities saying that don't pay that, it's actually creating you're feeding hackers to do better attack next time, because now they have financial resources. But unfortunately, when you're at that moment, I have happened to respond to a few ransomware attacks. When the sky is falling on you, of course, you have very limited options. And when at that moment, unfortunately, seems to be paying a little bit ransom seems reasonable. And indeed, even worse, insurance companies are also saying that, hey, pay that, and we're going to pay the 80% of that. So that's actually another problem is creating. Insurance companies are also saying that, hey, instead of you try to recover your data, which is going to cost me $20 million, you just go ahead and pay $100,000 ransomware, and I'll pay you 80,000 of them. So let's get rid of this problem. So unfortunately, it's a little bit chicken and egg problem. But the best way to kind of do that, never be in that situation. But obviously, if you are in there, before paying anything to hackers, check for backups. If it's clean backups, and try to restore it. Even if you are losing a couple of weeks of work, still returning from the backup is always the best. And if that backup is not available, unfortunately, some sophisticated hacker groups like Conti or collab groups, they really are aware of that. They look for the backups first, destroy them, and then infect the ransomware. That's the kind of the methodology. If you are in that situation, paying ransom is an option, but don't pay the out of number that they're mentioning. They usually come up with the very high numbers, but when you negotiate with them, they drop that number significantly, especially when you say that, hey, we are just an education company, we don't do any profit and all those stuff. Interesting things, but yes, sometimes they say, okay, yeah, we're going to reduce the price and all those things. So I know that these things sound really ridiculous, but unfortunately, even hacker groups on the other line, there's a human being, they just try to make some money. And if they see that there's a way that they can get $100,000, it's a good amount of money for them to just take that instead of just, forcing you to go for a full data recovery.
Kathleen, what is your research on people who are hit by ransomware, and what's the fallout?
Sure. So I looked at some of the ANISA data, which it really backs up what Candon is saying. That we do have a fair percentage. I think they had said maybe 46% that do pay the ransomware. And as he mentioned, you might not be getting the full story in these surveys. Now, of those, 18% still have their data leaked. I'm really concerned with the newer trend that they'll sell your data, right? So if recovery is what you're going after, having resilient systems and being able to recover your data from good backups is really your defensive measure that should be in place. But you still have this fear or the threat that a competitor might buy your data, right? So they might have their source of funds from yet someplace else besides just hitting you with ransomware. So backup and recovery is a foundational control that should be in place. There's even services. If you have treasured data, or you're more important data to the business, you could use immutable storage. So storage that backs up the data that can't be damaged by an attacker. So that's something to consider for some of your data. And obviously you have to weigh out what data means the most to my business. What do I have to protect at the highest level? And then consider those types of options. And they're in the cloud, so you can enable these types of options more easily without having to put your own infrastructure up to do it.
Thanks. I want to remind everybody who's watching that you can use that Q&A function down at the bottom of the Zoom app to send in questions that you have for any of the panelists, and we'll get to those, some user-submitted questions shortly. David, at Boston College, are you, what are you doing around kind of thinking about damage mitigation if there ever were a successful attack? Is there any way to kind of wall things off, or what's the approach?
Well, we've been doing a number of things, most of which I don't actually want to talk about since this is being recorded and all.
Sure.
That said, one of the things that I think is sort of interesting is we have what we think was a robust business continuity disaster recovery type of setup for higher education, probably not for a commercial business, having seen some of those, but for higher ed, we thought we were in pretty good shape. And when we actually went through and sort of did the let's exercise out that there's a ransomware event going on, and how are we going to respond and things like that, it turned out to be the case that what was happening, at least in the model of a ransomware event, didn't match the model of how we were going to do disaster recovery. And that has led to some rethinking. So we're trying to address that. And I guess what I mean by that, to go a little bit further, as opposed to just sort of tease it, is that a lot of disaster recovery plans assume that you lose either some set of people or some set of systems or some level of connectivity. So there's a pandemic or whatever, there's a gas leak and everybody has to leave the building, so you don't have people, right? Or the building burns down or blows up from the gas leak and you lose your systems, or there's a cable cut and you don't have access to the internet, and you sort of model all those things and figure out how you're going to recover from them. For the ransomware thing, because we're a multi-platform type of enterprise, and ransomware typically only hits a subset of those platforms. If somebody goes into your enterprise that has Linux and Macs and Windows and other custom operating systems, they don't actually end up encrypting all of them. They'll encrypt some set of one of those platforms. And we had just never really thought about what would happen to us if we lost a platform as opposed to a connection or a data center or a computer or what have you. And people were surprised at the way the different platforms were interrelated. And they'd say, well, how come this platform doesn't work even though it wasn't affected by the ransomware? And the answer is it was making calls to the other platform that was affected. And nobody ever really thought about that as something that they needed to worry about in terms of resiliency. So I'd say that would be an interesting exercise to go through, to just try to figure out what happens for the model of what the repercussions are if you lose a platform as opposed to you lose a set of hardware.
Those hidden repercussions will get you every time. We did have some questions submitted in advance, so I'll read some of these, and we'll see any of the three of you if you want to jump in on these. The first one from a person named Kim. I'm a faculty member and wondering if I should use a separate email, not my university email, for certain kinds of correspondence with colleagues or students. How vulnerable is our email? I have students who come to me with mental health and sexuality issues because I teach gender studies, and I want to be supportive, but I also feel increasingly vulnerable.
Sure. So I'm a professor, adjunct, and I'm assuming the person asking the question is getting probably deeper questions than what I receive, but I do, what she's asked really resonates. And so the first step I would take would be to ask students, ask colleagues, can we have these conversations in person? Because if your university is not providing a tool that has a level of security that makes you comfortable to have these conversations, and then that would be, concerning. And I would say most probably don't provide an email tool that has encryption of the data at rest, which is really getting to the heart of her concern. There are tools, so you could go out and, do a quick search and find something. But I would go to your department to see what could be offered rather than taking it on yourself. That way it's a supported technology, or try to have the conversations in person.
David, I would assume from your point of view, people going out and making their own technology decisions might be a bit problematic, but what's your perspective on this woman's question?
I would hope that we do a better job of trying to protect our students and faculty and staff than just if they went out and picked a random email provider. And then I think that person would be depending on sort of the level of anonymity provided by the fact that they're mixed in with a mass of people who are getting free email service from somewhere. I don't know that actually necessarily works in light of the comments about like the 14 billion credentials that are out there. Many of those are from free email services like Yahoo that have gotten hacked, if not ransomware. But it's a reasonable question. If you have that concern, you should talk to somebody in IT at your institution and just say, what are you doing, if anything, to give us protection against people getting into my email because I'm conducting sensitive conversations there? And that's a perfectly legitimate question. And if they don't have an answer, that you might suggest that it's important to develop that kind of service. And it depends on the size of the institution and the nature of it, but you might be surprised, and your institution does have something. Places that have a hospital or a medical center, or in the case of BC, a nursing school or something like that, you frequently need to have some sort of encrypted email that's available for HIPAA requirements and things like that. So it's possible that this person's concerns could be allayed if they just had a conversation with their technical staff about those concerns and they weren't aware of some services that are already available to them.
Camden, we also have a question that's a little more, I think, in your neck of the woods. Jeffrey asks, what are some tips for how cybersecurity vendors can develop relationships and partner with higher education institutions?
Yeah, that we do a lot. So indeed, the core of businesses that we do is, assessing the vendors before they deliver. Unfortunately, that's a big topic, but here's a kind of a short and slim version of it. Every vendor that you're working with, there is a cyber score for them. So just like your FICO score, that's financially that you can know how strong this person is, but also that's available in cybersecurity spaces. Black Hat is one of them. There are of course other competitors as well that can provide that. This is a very data-driven report that explains how strong your vendor is. Like, for example, if you're working with organizations like Okta or Workday or Accenture or whoever that, even the software providers like VMware, CrowdStrike, we actually know kind of how secure their software development lifecycle is, how their environment security implementations are. So you can actually get that when you're doing the vendor due diligence. Of course, traditionally we send the questionnaire to them and ask them, hey, how do you guys do, in terms of XYZ? It's always good to think, but the challenge with that is when you send them a questionnaire and ask them, hey, are you guys doing, patching? The answer is 99% is yes, we are patching. But when you do that actual analysis, you see that there are some services actually not being patched. So that, that's where this, objective organizations like Black Hat is coming into play to explain that how strong they are at. And especially for the SaaS and cloud transformation, this is a very big need, because previously, that every services that we're using in our perimeter, we were launching a vulnerability scanner to find out the vulnerabilities on those systems. And we were kind of patching those systems in-house, so we have time to kind of respond that. But now we're outsourcing everything to another organization, right? The email services or Slack or cloud services and everything. So when that's the case, obviously you can't just simply launch a vulnerability scan, because you got to scan the whole internet. It's not feasible. So you need a solution to kind of do those kind of things. And interesting though, unlike that, people assume that kind of hey, if I use an Microsoft, is it going to be secure? Microsoft has its own challenges as well. It's not that pinks and roses in there. It's that there are a lot of challenges that we also seeing that even the strangle established organization, they have problems. Just a kind of interesting statistics: T-Mobile breached 6 times in the last 5 years. So that doesn't mean that a brand name is secure. Is unfortunately, I'm also a T-Mobile subscriber, but I'm kind of asking what's going on here. So yeah, that's a very important piece of when you're doing vendor due diligence. Definitely get an objective report about that vendor from somewhere else.
Well, Candon, I enabled multi-factor authentication on my T-Mobile sign-in, so I'm keeping my fingers.
That's good. There you go.
We had a question from one of the viewers. Manuel asks, I understand that the human layer is probably the weakest and least served today. There are plenty of phishing simulation and personalized training companies out there, but what is missing in the human firewall side of things to reduce cyber attack likelihood? David, you want to weigh in on that one?
Sure. This is sort of the whole how can we train people better to not succumb to these types of attacks by bad actors. And the thing that I seem to have the most trouble with on the training thing is getting people to slow down. And it doesn't really get emphasized that much in the training stuff. It's like, don't click on bad links and, be cautious and stuff like that. And the whole stop, think, connect campaign was, I think, the whole point of the stop in the beginning was to slow people down, but people in the stop, think, connect, which was a great campaign the government sort of did, didn't really emphasize the stop enough, I don't think. And this whole concept of like mailbox zero that some people have of like, when I get a message and email, I want to like respond to it and just have an empty mailbox with 0 in it, really is problematic. Because I've talked to people who've fallen for these things and they're like, well, how was I supposed to know? And I was like, well, I don't know what happened. And they were like, I got the message in my inbox and I clicked on it right away and I responded because I respond to all emails within 10 minutes. And, now they have my login, you say, and they're doing these bad things, you say, and why didn't you fix that? And I was like, how can we fix it? You responded to it within 5 minutes. Like, no, there are a whole bunch of people on the internet who try to fix these things. The browser vendors try to fix these things. The people who do servers try to fix these things and take the web page down that people type the credentials into in the first place. The anti-malware companies are trying to do stuff. They can't all do stuff in 10 minutes, analyze the whole thing, and put the protections out there that would protect you. If we could just get people to slow down, that would help a ton. But getting people to pay attention to the slow down part turns out to be really, some subset of them just don't want to hear that.
So
That's my take. What do you think, Kathleen?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, David. And what I'd add is people also in education campaigns talk about a sense of urgency. And if a message creates a sense of urgency, to pause. I'll go a step further, and this has resonated with students. If you have any emotions tugged on, so there's the 4 F's of human behavior: food, fight, I'll leave out one of the F's, and food, feed. Oh, I'm forgetting some of the F's. So
Well, this one's a 4-letter word when you mess up, right?
You can do a longer word that's also an F that's not quite as but anyway, if you feel any of these emotions being tugged, it's a typical tactic of a threat actor to get you to respond, right? It creates that sense of urgency. So if you feel your emotions rising from a message, pause. And I know for myself, I get highly targeted ones where, they're triggering on something that they know you're going to respond to. And so you really have to be cautious of anything that's too good.
We've certainly,
maybe I can.
Candid, I'll come to you in one sec. Also we get ones that say it comes from my boss. It looks like it's coming from my boss, and it'll say, Aaron, I need you to review this document right away. And that's something that, you really have to stop and think, like, what email address is this? Candid, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that. So we always look at the scoreboard. Scoreboard obviously counts the goals, right? that they don't count the defenses. Like, defenders are blocking the stuff, and then there are all those, if you're looking on the scoreboard, yes, it seems that it's a 5-0, but if there was no defense, it will be, 10-0 or, 11. So it works, but the output of that is not being presented in the scoreboard. That's why kind of it's creating like, okay, we're doing a lot of training here, but why is not working? It is working. It's actually reducing the impact, but it's unfortunately not being counted in any of those statistics that's commonly available.
Candon, we had one more question from in advance that I think maybe you were starting to touch on. It's from David. Can we trust cloud solution providers like Microsoft to be forthcoming, transparent, and truthful when they experience a material data breach that compromised customer data and that occurred out of no fault but the cloud provider's own misconfiguration or such?
Yeah. So short answer is no, because cloud provider doesn't mean that they are going to keep everything secure. It's a shared responsibility platform. So cloud providers or SaaS providers can do everything to some extent and leave the rest to you. So like, for example, if you put a very simple password to your storage bucket, there's no cloud provider will help you to fix that. So it's your responsibility to make sure that the service layer, the application layer, what we call, is going to be under the end user's responsibility to keep that secure. The underlying infrastructure, the servers, the patching that servers, like let's say there's a, if you can remember that there was Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities, right? So as a user, you can patch those vulnerabilities because it's at a hardware level problem. It's a CPU level problems that needs to be patched. And the cloud providers are stepping up and they fix that problem almost in the 48 hours. It's lightning fast patches that ever been done on the computer history. So they do that. Most organizations actually, it takes their weeks, if not months, to patch those things. So cloud providers, when it comes to data responsibility, they are very responsive. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be always secure, because you got to do your own part as well. It's going to make that cloud provider secure. Otherwise, it's not secure out of the box.
David or Kathleen, did you want to weigh in on that? Or?
So sure. For Center for Internet Security, we also support state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations and organizations with very few resources. So this is something we've been pursuing a bit to see how can we make it better in terms of cloud provider offerings, and could we make them more secure out of the box? And so you can purchase some that align to various sets of frameworks, security control frameworks, all of the big ones, the ISO 27001, NIST for government requirements, CIS controls, and benchmarks. And ideally, they would also manage these over time. And that's the current gap that does place a burden on higher ed and anyone else consuming the services. And so in time, because of some technology changes, I believe that we will see this shift, and we will see a shift towards not just built-in security, which is the government, the US government is increasingly requiring of vendors, but I'd also like to see it managed over time to get to some of Candon's points here, so that you can have more trust and not have to hire resources specific to every cloud, because they all have different security control mechanisms and different ways that you interface with them. But if we could get them, meeting specific benchmarks and controls and manage to those over time, we'll be in a much better place. We can't expect each organization to take this burden on. It's not feasible. It's clearly not working. So we have to do something different. We'll get there.
David, any thoughts on the cloud credibility issue?
I don't know, Aaron. I mean, the thing I would say is the major incidents that we have had over the past 3 or 4 years have all been at third parties, where the data wasn't residing on our computer or network. It was a third party, quote unquote, cloud partner. So I think that at least some cloud partners report those sorts of things because they've reported them to us, and then we get disappointed and we're like, darn, you lost our data. But that I don't think anyone can comment on whether there's 100% compliance of that sort of thing and whether everyone does it. But I think I can absolutely tell you that it happens, and it's very troubling. Right. I think there's a expectation on some people's part that if they sort of outsource this to a third party, that they're getting rid of the responsibility, and that the third party will do a better job of managing it than they would. And perhaps these third parties were doing a better job of managing it than we would have if we had had the same data at our data center. But nonetheless, they did get attacked, as various people have pointed out the entire session. It's not just a higher ed thing, and lots of people end up getting breached with various security issues, and just putting your application or data, quote unquote, in the cloud doesn't solve the problem or relieve you as a third party of responsibility.
I wanted to bring up an issue we were talking about as on the panel before we came online, which is another large trend, remote working. You know, a lot of us now are logging in from all over the place, and I'm curious whether that helps raise security awareness or maybe creates new vulnerabilities. I don't know, Kathleen, why don't you start? How is the trend of remote working helping or hurting us in malware?
Well, so for malware, initially it created an influx of attacks, and the pandemic and specific topics of relevance in the moment are used as those as part of those attacks. But in the long run, coupled with something called zero trust, we will get to a better place. It's going to take time though, because it's a complete different architecture for managing security. And basically it means that one system or application or user or even a component doesn't trust the next one. And so each one has to be as secure as possible and has to be managed and monitored, and validating that everything that connects to it is as expected, right? And so that we won't get there overnight, but it represents a real opportunity for change. And having the remote workers has accelerated this a fair amount, because users are at home and they have to connect into systems. And so some of the principles that go along with zero trust, and they've been discussed already today, like multi-factor authentication, use of encryption, they have to get deployed in those scenarios. So it's accelerated some of the areas of zero trust. And, you know, I think in another 5 years, we will be talking about security in a different way because of zero trust, because of a move to built-in security. And what I'd like to push more is managed over time for all the under-resourced organizations.
Camden or David, do you want to weigh in on the remote worker situation?
Yeah, Catalin, actually, spot on that. So the zero trust that we were trying to implement for many years, as you know, that zero trust is not something new. It's been there more than a decade. But we were kind of segmenting our networks like untrusted public network and trusted internal network, right? So, and then internal network, there are lightweight policies that we apply. And we were pushing that, hey, no, that's not right. Inside the, you know, somebody internal network doesn't mean that it's a trusted. So you gotta do X, Y, Z as well. So now it's this remote workforce, and we gave up on that now because we don't have that person inside the network any longer. Now it is, you know, naturally pushing us to a remote workforce, but we caught off guard. So honestly speaking, in the very early days, and everybody was just trying to figure it out, just you know, fish from out of the water, and kind of, what are we gonna do? It was a big mess, and unfortunately, it caused a lot of, you know, malwares and ransomware attacks. So it made actually a big peak back in those days. Now it's, you know, slowing down, but unfortunately, this Russia-Ukraine increased a little bit as well. But anyhow, still, at least the reason that COVID created this remote workforce is actually a good traction to zero trust, which we had to implement anyway. And I see that a lot of organizations, they start doing that, kind of securing the end devices, but still not trusting them, even if they secure that, and making sure that the policies are applying, just like an external devices. It's helping a lot, and in terms of the zero trust model.
David, is that a model that you also find attractive?
Yes, we would like to get to zero trust at some point. It's difficult to implement zero trust.
Can you elaborate a little? I mean, is it something, it would require replacing a lot of equipment, or?
Well, I think Camden was talking about sort of grouping things, and he cited a couple of possible groups. We're not Boston College isn't that large an educational institution. We're not tiny, but we're not large either. And within a couple of weeks, we will probably have something like 50 or 60,000 devices showing up connected to the network. So positing that for each of those 50 or 60,000 devices, and again, there are all sorts of things. Some of them are Roku sticks that students bring to stick into TVs or what have you, right? Each of them, we have a model for each of them of what they should connect to and what they shouldn't connect to, and it's a lot locked down on an individual basis is not easy to get to. Even with zero trust, you end up doing some level of grouping to maintain your sanity.
I got it. Okay. Kathleen, I wanted to ask you, you've a couple of times talked about some of the different ways that data can be misused in a ransomware attack. But I'm curious, what are the sorts of data that we see in higher ed that are different kinds of data? Some is course data, some is student data. What else? What's going on with the data?
Well, it could also be the actual course material, right? And then the students' responses to those material. It could also be research data. And David probably can hit on this a lot deeper, being responsible for that at a university. And so you do have to, with any organization, you have to think about what are your assets that keep the business running. And so research data is absolutely a priority if you're funded with grants, and that helps to keep your university afloat, right? And so that research data getting sold to the highest bidder really could be a concern outside of the possibility of it being destroyed, right? So you can back it up, you can make it recoverable, but then also if it is taken, do you go that extra measure of having it encrypted now if it's, treasured data? And, I think that is something new to consider, but hard because it's not easy to encrypt data at rest in all forms, and to make it difficult to make that put into a form when taken by a threat actor that they can't get at it in an unencrypted way. And then just the costs of it, right? And so to do that for every research program, that could be difficult. But yeah, this newer threat or emerging threat of the data being sold is quite concerning, because it really changes how we've been thinking about ransomware, in just that we lose our data or it gets leaked, but it gets sold to somebody else. So somebody else is paying that money to the threat actors, to Camden's point earlier, that perpetuates these types of attacks.
David, are there different layers of data? And
I think that's a fair question, and I think I'd prefer to answer it by reversing it and saying, what data don't we have? A big research university has been compared to a city. And the businesses that we're not in, I'd say we're not in manufacturing mostly. But anything else you can conceive of, we're unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a university has its fingers in the pie. So there are dining halls that are doing like food service and acting like restaurants, and they usually take credit cards if you go visit a university and want to pay, right? So we have all the credit card things. Universities that do student loans are defined as banks, and they have financial aid information. And as I indicated, if there's a medical or nursing school, there's medical information. And even if there isn't a medical or nursing school, there's probably some on-campus infirmary type place people can go when they're sick that holds student medical information. So really, it's what don't we have? I believe they're decommissioned now, so I will talk about it briefly, but there were 2 universities in Massachusetts that had nuclear reactors on their campuses that were running for a number of years. So across the breadth of universities, we do pretty much everything, and that's sort of the challenge and the joy. I mean, athletics isn't necessarily a big deal, but people talk about the Patriots or whatever, and then we have a 45,000 foot stadium that people show up at for football games in the fall, and we got to do all that. And all the financial and security things associated with managing the physical security of that many people coming in and out. And it's a really big task that universities have. It's not, you don't have the ability to focus on a given sector or set of sectors that you actually are specializing in.
Candon, do you have a point of view on data protection and different layers of data maybe requiring different approaches?
Yes, that's what we do. Go ahead, Ken.
I maybe add a kind of a small comment on it. So data on universities is not as important as like a healthcare data or like a financially data, but still very important data. On top of that, most of the time what we are seeing that when hackers compromise a university network, they usually like to use that like a botnet, or even worse, like a decoy. What we call is the kind of a use the server to attack somewhere else. And that's exactly what happened to OFAC breach in back in 2013, I think. The universities were attacking the organizations. The same thing happened to DHS as well. The universities are attacking. So they kind of were saying, okay, why universities are attacking? Universities are not attacking indeed, but they have been compromised and then used. We see that in deep dark web. There are some torrent leaks, especially that like child porns has actually been stored on some of the legitimate organizations, including some higher eds as well. So that's the problem is, once your system has been compromised, there are a lot of ways to monetize that. So ransomware is just one of them. So obviously this locking data and selling back to you is one of the common methodology, but it doesn't mean that we don't have that high being safer side. No, that there are hackers will figure out a way to monetize that opportunity. Unfortunately, the other options are even worse than ransomware. So I wouldn't bet on that when it comes to the data.
Well, Candon, Kathleen, and David, thank you for the conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Andrew Smith from Wasabi for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Yeah, and on behalf of Wasabi, I just want to thank Aaron and the panel for the lively discussion today, highlighting the importance of ransomware, of course, and some of the real world examples of how organizations are strategizing to address the challenge. I guess since I'm the last person, I'd like to kind of reiterate 3 key points that I heard from the panel. First, from Kathleen, that there's really no silver bullet from ransomware. I think this is an important baseline kind of conclusion to come to. It's not about, we don't set out to solve the problem of ransomware. We strategize and iterate on how to help prevent and mitigate it. And then from David, really interesting thought about how ransomware is kind of an everyone problem in terms of how platforms and data are interconnected, right? It's more than just a disaster recovery problem. It's about understanding all those interdependencies and how you can maintain that kind of, I guess, confluence of access between applications and data. And then Candon said something really interesting that I had never thought about before, which is the unintended consequence of ransomware insurance, and how it increases the prevalence of potentially increases the prevalence of payment and kind of feeds additional attacks. A little bit of a vicious cycle there, but really we've seen that market grow over the past couple of years, but I've never thought about that kind of counterintuitive aspect of what's happening with ransomware insurance. So 3 key points that hopefully I can highlight as takeaways to this presentation. But again, on behalf of Wasabi, thank you to Aaron and thank you to our panel today for a great discussion. And thank you to our attendees for joining.